I'm Ann Poulson. I'm the Associate Curator of Collections here at the Henry Art Gallery. And I am in the Henry at the moment in the Study Center with the objects that Professor Susan Gaylard is going to talk to us about. I'm really excited about this, but before we get started, I would like to read our land acknowledgement, which is very important for me and for the Henry. We at the Henry Art Gallery and the University of Washington live and work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the shared waters of all tribes and bands, named and unnamed, including Suquamish, Duwamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. The land acknowledgement reminds us of our connections and indebtedness to the peoples and the more than human kin where we live and work. As we spend the next while together, we pay respects to elders past and present. If you have any questions about that, there are some really great resources online that I fully recommend that you look up a little bit more about land acknowledgements. So today is our second installment in the Unpacking Form and Function series. If any of you were with us last week, I would just like to apologize again for the technical difficulties. I think we've worked out everything this time, so we should be good to go. And I would just like to remind everyone that we are recording these programs. So yeah, you're being recorded. All right, now I will pass this over to Susan, who will lead this fantastic discussion about these Schiaparelli pieces. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne. I'd like to really thank Anne and the Henry Gallery for their kind invitation for me to talk about some of these things. It's really just a treat for me. I'd also like to thank Clara Berg and the Museum of History and Industry for the use of some of their images, which we'll get to. Thank you both. I'm going to start with the sweater that I think is the most exciting piece of clothing we have in the Henry Gallery. It's possibly the most exciting piece of clothing we have in the Puget Sound. It's just amazing. And I know you're looking at it thinking, yeah, okay. We have all probably seen the classic trompe-l'oeil tuxedo t-shirt, right? If you order it right now, it can be here by Saturday for $7.96 off Amazon. It's still a very, very popular thing. This sweater, which we have in the Henry, it's laid out on one of Anne's tables over there, is one of the very first trompe-l'oeil sweaters in the world, designed by Elsa Schiaparelli in Paris as part of her very first collection in 1928. It was this completely new idea, and it's still very obviously influential today. It's pretty amazing. And what sets it apart immediately are these two Schiaparelli hallmarks of originality, at the time was extremely original, and very, very careful craftsmanship. It's actually made with a special kind of knitted stitch with multiple threads that create this strange sort of textured pattern on the front. Unlike Chanel and other designers at the time who were using machine knitting, this was knitted by hand. And this extra layer of thread produced a kind of structure so that unlike your tuxedo t-shirt, this sweater was stretchy, but it didn't lose its shape. It remained quite well shaped. You can see it's got this very dark outside thread with the white thread inside, where except the very carefully detailed collar where the white thread and the red thread come to the front. And here's the back of the collar. And at the cuffs, and I love that there is such careful detailing that it looks like these are cuffs where somebody just forgot to add the cufflinks so that you've got that separation. The designer's label back here, it was printed at the time. This was before Schiaparelli invested in embroidered labels. So the label has washed out, but it was there. It was definitely there. And one of the really exciting things about the sweater is this was the object that launched Schiaparelli's career. She had an Armenian refugee knit a sweater like this with a kind of butterfly bow at the neck, and she wore it out to lunch, to very smart society lunch. Schiaparelli had the enormous advantage of an aristocratic and intellectual background, which made it much easier for her to make friends with people who had money to spend, and also for her to wear her own collections in advantageous situations. So the sweater that she wore was such an immediate hit that she got an order from New York for 40 copies on the spot. It was featured in American Vogue in December 1927 as an artistic masterpiece, and it was featured again in British Liberty magazine in March 1928. She followed up this success with a range of different items: swimsuits, beach pajamas, tweed sportswear, ski suits, evening dresses, the very scandalous divided skirt, culottes, so on. And her success was so immediate, really, that in 1928, she was able to move to a larger space in Rue de la Paix, in a very, very fashionable area. And her original sign on the door said, Schiaparelli pour le sport, Schiaparelli for sportswear. And then she eventually expanded that. So we've got this playful trompe-l'oeil plus a very intricate and specialized artisanal technique. These two things really characterized Schiaparelli's most famous pieces: playfulness and technique. But they also characterized her much more everyday pieces for the rest of her collections. And this is where the objects in the Henry come into play. Okay, so who was the Schiaparelli? Why is she so important? Why do I think she's so important and exciting? In 1934, Schiaparelli became the first woman fashion designer to appear on the front cover of Time magazine, despite the fact that she had zero training in dressmaking, none. She dressed the major socialites and prominent women of the day, including Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor, Daisy Fellows, Mrs. Winston Churchill, the American Helen Keller. She also dressed many film stars, including Marlene Dietrich, Greta Garbo, Mae West, Ginger Rogers, Katharine Hepburn, and she made costumes for a large number of films. In 1934, in this article in Time magazine, they considered Schiaparelli one of the world's topmost couturiers. And it's fascinating to read the article because they relegate Coco Chanel to the second tier, kind of the B team. Really? I know, really. Schiaparelli was the first couture house to do licensing in any big way. It was also the first couture house to license the production of designer sunglasses in 1952. Designer sunglasses, that's just a normal thing. She introduced the color shocking pink into the fashion world in 1937. This is a color that you've probably never thought much about, but it really was considered quite shocking at the time because it was not part of the Western European wardrobe. So why do we all recognize the name Chanel, but hardly anyone knows the name Schiaparelli? I think the items in the Henry give us a few clues, and we're going to come back to this question. So she dominated 1930s fashion, combining the experimental with the very practical. And what's especially exciting about the pieces in the Henry is that they suggest how Schiaparelli was such a massive commercial success despite being really avant-garde. So nowadays, people who know about Schiaparelli tend to remember her for her collaborations with surrealists like Salvador Dali or Jean Cocteau, or they remember that she collaborated with the great photographers of the time, Cecil Beaton, Man Ray. Most famously, she designed the shoe hat and the lobster dress with Salvador Dali. But she was maybe even more revolutionary for trying things for the first time that nowadays we accept as normal. The trompe-l'oeil sweater, the boiler suit, the built-in bra, the swimsuit that is backless to allow your back to get a tan, fabrics printed with newsprint. That was Schiaparelli. She even introduced the first couture house's boutique of ready-to-wear clothes. That's Schiaparelli. So this blue jacket that we have in the Henry gives us a sense of how she was both a commercial giant, because it was bought by Mrs. Plestcheff from Seattle, who clearly wore it and loved it, and the kind of designer that Harper's Bazaar in 1937 said was, I quote, expressing our life and times in her little suits and dresses and in her unique materials. So here we have this classic chic shape that doesn't draw attention to itself, but it's actually pretty unique. It's a very unusual knitted fabric with a self pattern in it, which is also typically Schiaparelli. She experimented with all kinds of natural and synthetic materials. And of course, it has these extremely quirky metal buttons in the shape of a sailor smoking a pipe. Buttons, strange and whimsical buttons made out of all sorts of materials, were one of Schiaparelli's biggest hallmarks. Of course, we also see in this a tailoring and a cut that show the level of careful couture, making it a pretty special little jacket. So here's a wool coat. It looks like a nice wool coat. It has large and gaping patch pockets, which to us might look kind of normal interesting, but they were really a departure from what was expected of women's clothing. They draw attention to women's hips, and they're kind of almost aggressively practical. They're so big and gaping that you could actually fit a bottle of wine into each pocket, and maybe at the Q&A and can show us just how big they are. You also get a sense of that it's maybe not just a simple black coat. It has this unusual whimsical twist, the exaggerated line of the collar and these enormous buttons made of wood and metal. And on the backside, we see that the buttons are actually fasteners. They're not really buttons at all. In the 1930s, Schiaparelli was the very first designer to give her collections a theme. She was the one who made the runway presentation into a thematic, spectacular theatrical show. So she had the circus collection, the Commedia dell'arte collection, the pagan collection, the Zodiac collection, and so on. This coat has these masks for buttons, which suggests that this might have been the Commedia dell'arte collection, which was her last really spectacular collection in 1938. But the label on the coat is kind of fascinating. It's a bit of a mystery to us. It's labeled as produced in Rue de la Paix. Okay, but the coat is dated to 1937 by the museum, by the gallery. Schiaparelli's house moved to Place Vendôme in 1935. So either this was made before 1935 and produced in Rue de la Paix, or it was made after 1935 and the label was added from another item later, just to identify the coat as a Schiaparelli. The stitching to me suggests maybe the latter, but it means we can't really answer the question of when exactly was this coat made. It's a bit of a mystery, but it's one of those classic pieces. You look at it, it's whimsy, it's whimsical and quirky, but I would wear it today. It's timeless despite being stylish and quirky. Okay, this is another example of that timeless but quirky look. This came from the very famous Zodiac collection of winter 1938 to 1939. The collection was presented in August 1938. And at first glance, they look like quite a nice, smart jacket and skirt. And this is the genius of Schiaparelli. There is so much more going on here. So first of all, the jacket has very gentle shoulder pads. Schiaparelli actually popularized the use of shoulder pads in women's clothes. Who knew, right? Once again, we have an asymmetrical patch pocket that dramatically draws attention to itself. Typical of Schiaparelli is the extremely fine detailed embroidery on the velvet collar, cuffs, and pocket. It's in metallic thread with rhinestones and plastic buttons, all referencing the stars and planets, as well as the meteoric rise of the designer. Schiaparelli collaborated with many of the best artisans in clothing production, and with many of them, she collaborated for many, many years. We also see in some of the items in this collection, although not here, as far as I can tell, we see the sign of the Big Dipper or the Great Bear, which was Schiaparelli's personal hallmark because it was the shape of the moles on her cheek. So it was her favorite constellation. The back of the jacket has a cord running diagonally down it with some shirring at the hem. This is classic Schiaparelli. It's totally unexpected, and it requires extreme precision tailoring. The buttons on this jacket, those are weird, right? They're in the shape of a woman's head. These are definitely buttons from the Zodiac collection, but they're a bit of a mystery to us because the stitching is kind of uneven. They could be from another outfit. They might have been moved to accommodate the body changes of the owner. We're not sure. I don't know if Anne's come up with another solution to this mystery, but it is worth remembering that well into the 1970s, it was quite normal for people to save buttons from worn out clothing and to reuse them. And that would be especially the case for unusual or precious buttons like these ones. So the Zodiac collection, just to give a sort of a broader sense of what it was doing, it was extraordinarily visually rich. It had lots of shiny bits. It's worth Googling Zodiac collection Schiaparelli just to see what comes up. It was part of a mock Baroque revival in the late 1930s, part of a humorous reaction to what was seen in some circles as the starkness of modernism, all of these clean lines. This was a bit of a reaction to that. The skirt that goes with the jacket is very plain, but it's beautifully crafted. And it has this very obvious zipper down the back. Yeah, okay, so what? Well, Schiaparelli popularized the zip fastener for women's clothes in 1935. Until Schiaparelli, zippers were fairly new, and they would show up in children's clothing, men's sportswear, but it was considered absolutely scandalous to have a zipper presented visibly on women's clothes, literally inviting someone to unzip the clothing. But it was immediately very popular. And of course, this made sense because fewer women had servants to help them get dressed. The zipper was much more democratic, and it also suggested women's control over their own body. In addition, it was a nod of appreciation to the new technologies. Schiaparelli in her youth would have been quite influenced by the Futurists, who were a major artistic movement in Italy. So all of those things, she often liked to embrace new technologies, new kinds of fabric, materials, and so on. And of course, the genius of this outfit is you could wear it almost anywhere. It's comfortable enough and stylish enough to go shopping. You could go out to a smart lunch. You could go to cocktails. You could even go to the theater. It's a very expensive satin-backed silk crepe with a crepe lining and this exquisite handcrafted detailing, but it's also very versatile. These pretty easy to wear separates are very, very, very Schiaparelli, very practical. Okay, the black wool dress. This was from Schiaparelli's second last collection before the outbreak of World War II in spring 1939. So Chanel popularized the little black dress in 1926, but Schiaparelli brought in her own little addition, which was the small cape that gets worn with the dress. And it's incredible. In the Henry, we have both the dress and the cape that it came with, which is really unusual. Most collections, you know, this kind of thing gets dispersed. So it looks like quite a nice dress. So we have a closer look at it. It's got a very sculptural neckline. Again, there are shoulder pads with lingerie straps, so nobody's going to see your bra. It has an underarm gusset where all the little lines of fabric match up. And you can see again this extreme precision tailoring at the waist with multiple seams and the pattern of the fabric lining up perfectly. And once again, we have the visually obvious zip fastener with a little press stud to make sure that the zip doesn't actually come undone until the wearer is ready to undo it. There are actually two obvious zippers on this dress. And one of the zippers has a closure that has been carefully covered in wool Again, showing the level of precision detailing in producing an item like this. Okay, so I'm not a Chanel expert, but that's a different program in this set of talks. World War II shows maybe most clearly the very divergent paths of Chanel and Schiaparelli. So Chanel closed her couture house, fired her workers, and she ended up moving into the Hotel Ritz, which became the headquarters of the Nazi occupation in Paris. She had a long liaison with a German officer, and in 1944 fled to Switzerland to avoid repercussions for her activity as a collaborator. And for decades, there were sort of whisperings about what did Chanel really get up to, until in about 10 years ago, Hal Vaughan published some pretty compelling evidence that Chanel was in fact a German agent. Okay. Schiaparelli, very different story. She tried to keep at least some employees on the payroll after the war broke out. She put together a cash and carry collection after the war broke out in September 1939 with huge pockets so that women could just get up and go anytime. And they could have the hands free to drive a car or grab children or carry things. She also used camouflage. This was the first use of camouflage in haute couture. Again, something else we take for granted. She sold an evening dress disguised as a day dress. I think this is so brilliant. You pull the ribbon and the skirt lengthened down into an evening dress. So very practical, very Schiaparelli. And after Germany invaded Finland, Schiaparelli put together a collection in January 1940 using a lot of Finnish style embroidery. In 1940, she came to the US on a speaking tour. And this is the most amazing picture that we have here in Mohai from her visit to Seattle when she gave a talk at the Washington Athletics Club titled Clothes Make the Woman. So she toured, I believe, 42 cities in 2 months and gave 42 talks, some to really enormous audiences. I believe in Minnesota, one audience was 36,000 people. She really had an enormous following in the US. And she returned to Paris, but life in occupied Paris became quite risky for a prominent Italian who was not in favor of the Nazis. So she escaped to the US and worked in various different ways to support the war in France, including some pretty humble work in hospitals as a nurse's aide, making beds and washing patients and so on. In 1945, she returned to Paris. And in 1946, she released the world's first capsule wardrobe designed for travel. And to me, this is the most exciting thing ever. So it was 6 dresses, 1 reversible coat, so reversible for day or night, and 3 folding hats. And the whole wardrobe was less than 12 pounds. It was a media sensation. I think it was at least 2 decades ahead of its time because it didn't sell very well. The few people who had money wanted to spend it on the hyper feminine designs that would ultimately dominate the late 40s and early 50s. So after World War II, Chanel and the new designer Dior really dominated. The fashion world was quite conservative. It valued highly feminine, really nostalgic styles in contrast with the rationing and practicality of wartime clothes. I would describe it as the 1940s and early 50s trying to forget the tomboy look of the 20s and the more avant-garde experiments of the 1930s, which had served Elsa Schiaparelli so well. So that brings us to our last item that's in the Henry, which is a very different kind of style, a woman's hat from around 1950. It's light pink. It's not that shocking Schiaparelli pink. It's very contained. It still has a pretty whimsical design. There are 4 circular pieces of felt that are joined with raffia that's been crocheted. So we have these contrasting materials and pretty high level of craftsmanship, creating a hat that looks pretty soft and floppy, right? When you actually pick it up, it's very carefully molded and quite stiff. to me, possibly the most interesting thing about this hat is actually in the label. So here's the official Schiaparelli label. She no longer has to give her address because she's Schiaparelli. Everybody knows where she is. She's in Paris at Place Vendôme. Underneath that, there is a Made in Italy label, which is interesting in itself because the Made in Italy label only became standard in 1980. So this is pretty interesting. We know that Schiaparelli was quite proud of her country, or relieved, I should say, for the reversal at the end of World War II. She was fairly outspoken in her disapproval of Mussolini. So that may have played into this, I'm not sure. Underneath, there is also a third label saying that this hat was union made in the United States. I don't really know what to make of this. Maybe Anne has some insights. To me, it looks like another example of Schiaparelli's success in international branding and her popularity in the United States. After the war, she opened a boutique in New York City, which allowed her to produce items directly in the US. There were some big issues with imports, especially initially when she put zippers on clothes. There was a huge holdup. They weren't allowed to import zippers into the US. So the very last item I'm going to show you is actually in the Museum of History and Industry, Mohai. And it gives a little bit of a sense of why Schiaparelli might have closed her fashion house in 1954, just as Chanel was reopening her fashion house. So this dress may have been made in 1951. This is according to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It seems a compelling date to me. This was during the time that Hubert Givenchy was working with Schiaparelli. He was the main designer of the ready-to-wear collection and probably collaborated on this. So it has that new, feminine, and extremely nostalgic shape of the tiny waist and the huge full skirt that echoed the 1840s or even the 1780s. This shape was most famously celebrated by the new couturier Christian Dior in 1947. When it was introduced in 1947, it was deeply scandalous and wasteful. It was just a shock to everybody. Everybody was horrified because it was right after the war when fabric was still rationed. It was also, the shape was also seen by many people as a huge setback for women. Stuck back into corsets and huge encumbering skirts after they'd spent 6 years kind of keeping the world running, doing men's jobs. So it has this very nostalgic shape, the so-called new look shape, but the dress also shows some pretty typical Schiaparelli daring. It's strapless, it's sleeveless, it has a low back right here, and it's very sculptural and theatrical. You can see it's got a very obvious overskirt and underskirt. It's made more sculptural and theatrical by the contrast between the black and this trademark shocking pink, which doesn't come out quite as well in the photographs, but I do believe it is really shocking pink. This kind of detailing with the black beading on the shocking pink would have been recognizable at the time as Schiaparelli. The bright pink bow on the butt that was embroidered with jet black became a Schiaparelli hallmark in 1947. So this would have been recognizable. So it's more daring and look at me than many of the soft feminine styles of the early 1950s. And it would also take someone with a taste for theater to wear it successfully. This is the kind of dress that's also extremely difficult to copy. Schiaparelli had been so successful in the 1920s and 30s because many of her designs were instantly copied all around the world. And surprisingly, she never complained about this. She saw it as free publicity, and she actually traded on it through extensive licensing agreements. But copying bothered most of the other couture houses. So in 1947, they imposed new rules that drastically limited visual access to couture collections. So it became much harder for anyone to copy couture. But by the same token, it became much harder to sell new designs. And Schiaparelli complains about these new restrictions in her autobiography, saying, well, really, everything's different since the war. Her house began to lose money on its couture collections, even though she had some great licensing agreements going. And in 1954, she closed the couture house. So from just a few items in the Henry and a couple of items in Mohai, we get these amazing insights into the career of one of the 20th century's most influential, and I would argue most underappreciated women. Thank you to the Henry and Mohai. Anne?
Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. I never tire of hearing about Schiaparelli and looking at some of these beautiful pieces that she created. So I welcome anyone to ask questions. If they want to see a detail of the pieces, I have them out here. If you have a question for Dr. Gaylard, you can ask her. You can also put them in the chat if you like. So we have a little while, so feel free to chat about these pieces. So we were talking about the sweater the other day when you came to visit, and so I'd seen online somewhere that someone had created a pattern for the sweater, and so I looked that up again.
Ooh.
And it turns out that the Schiaparelli actually published the pattern for the sweater, so you can use the original pattern.
I didn't know that. That's amazing.
But that the cut isn't very fashionable anymore. It's loose, it's boxy, a lot of people don't really like it, and we're not used to knitting from older patterns. And so a museum professional changed the pattern a bit to give it a more sleeker, more modern fit, and has posted that on her website. I think you can find it in Ravelry for anybody who knits. It's not this sweater, and it's not the original one that you mentioned. It's one of the other ones that has an asymmetrical bow scarf thing. But it was a lot of fun, and someday when my knitting improves a little bit, I certainly plan to give it a go, just not yet.
Thanks, Anne. That's awesome. Yeah, it's kind of an astonishing story of how Schiaparelli collaborated with this eventually quite enormous team of Armenian refugees who all knew the special stitch that nobody in Paris had seen before. It's kind of amazing.
We have Caitlin, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for this great presentation. It's super fascinating to see the collection in the Henry and to learn more about Schiaparelli. Just talking about the people that were working for her, do you know more about the kind of, you just mentioned this group of women. I'm curious to know more about like who was doing the production over time, if you know about that.
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things that to be quite clear, I am not a Schiaparelli expert. I dabble in Schiaparelli stuff because I find her so fascinating. One of the things that comes through most clearly from all the accounts of Schiaparelli is that she was very loyal to her team. You know, keeping her house open during the war was probably not financially wise in the end. People did patronize it. But that was considered, she seems to have felt that she owed it to her team to do this. The people who worked for her, by and large, you know, they seem to have come for a short time and then they ended up staying for a very long time. Pierre Cardin actually worked for her briefly. Givenchy worked for her for 4 years. But much of the sort of the fine craftsmanship, she would rely on specific production houses for example, for the embroidery, for the making of shoes for her collections. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. That's helpful and very interesting to know that Givenchy and Cardin worked for her as well. I would also love to see up close of the buttons more. The buttons are fantastic.
Sure. Yeah, we've got a few different fantastic buttons.
And do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, why don't I can take over.
Let's go to your camera.
Oops, sorry, I'm also, let's see. Now I learned how to do this the other day and I'm still, let's see, participants.
Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Okay. Okay, so this is the jacket, or we can see, let me just unhook this. These are the buttons that we're talking about, how they are, you can see they're not evenly spaced, which, considering how carefully everything is constructed, suggests to us that this was not the original work. But let's see, where's the camera? These are molded metal. And then, pardon me, we're just gonna walk on over here. These are the sailor buttons. Sure. A little bit abstract, and these are also molded. And then we've got these fantastic large Commedia dell'arte masks that are not actual buttons, but placed on top as though they were. Ah, yeah. And Clara over at Mohai says that they have a plus chef dress where the buttons have been replaced. So it looks like something that she did every once in a while.
Yeah. So while you were looking at that coat, everyone can see those amazing, amazing patch pockets that are very much more dramatic when you see them than in the flesh, as it were. Yeah. So there's a question about how the items came into the Henry's collection, which I believe Anne is going to talk much more about in a future talk. Is that right, Anne? The plus chef.
Yes, that is. So Gwendolyn Kharkiv plus chef was from the Kharkiv family, were prominent in Seattle in the 19th and, oh, sorry, I keep spinning around, 20th century. And she was a very well-dressed woman. Her second husband so they lived abroad and were part of international social society life. And then she came back to Seattle and eventually donated a number of her couture pieces to us at the Henry and to Mohai. And she founded the Gwendolyn Kharkiv Plus Chef Decorative and Design Arts Fund, which that Plus Arts Fund is what has funded this program today. And we are going to be doing a second series of programs that is going to be specifically about the fashion that she has donated to us. And so we'll hear a lot more about her life then, and how she went about choosing and acquiring a lot of these clothes. But she left us some really gorgeous pieces, which we are happy to have. And we love to work with Mohai because when you put them together, you create quite a wardrobe.
Yeah. I mean, to me, just the fact that we have this many Schiaparelli pieces, almost all from the Plus Chef collection, says an enormous amount, both about Mrs. Plus Chef's extraordinary access to couture, but also her generosity to the museums of Seattle. Because that huge, the really, really beautiful pink and black one is not a Plus Chef, the one that we saw right at the end. But if she had still been shopping in Paris, that's precisely the kind of thing that she would have donated to one of our museums, because we have similar items, or items of a sort of a similar level in the Henry from Mrs. Plus Chef.
Yes. Well, let's see. Does anybody else have any other questions that you would like to ask?
So there's a comment that the hat looks like a baseball.
It does.
It kind of does. Yeah,
It totally does.
It's that crochet. Oh, and do you want to talk a little bit about the cape? I don't have much to say about the cape. I find it quite mysterious.
Well, one of the things that I'm really curious about this cape is that we have these two large buttonholes here,
Yeah.
which I'm guessing had some sort of mechanism that would then hold the cape closed. Oh, sorry, that was my hand in front of the camera. To secure it when worn, but we don't have whatever she used. So I'm very curious to know what that would have looked like, because I'm guessing, judging by Schiaparelli's tendency with buttons and dramatic touches, that would have been quite something to see.
Yeah.
It's just this lovely little capelet and fits over the top of this gorgeous little dress quite nicely.
Oh, so there's a question about Schiaparelli working with camouflage fabric during and after the war. Can I talk a little bit more about this?
Oh, absolutely.
Anne, do you have insights into that?
I do not. So I would love to hear anything that you have.
So I do not either. You know, her initial collections during the war were these sort of trying one thing, trying another thing, really doing anything to keep her team employed and to sort of give people work. We know that she made a uniform for the French Salvation Army women workers early in the war. I don't know what she did with camouflage fabric, except that this is something that all of the critics mention. While she was in the US from 1941 to 45, mid 45 or so, she did not do anything with couture or fashion at all, despite the fact that there were quite a few pressures on her, you know, oh, you should really do this, you should really do that. And she just refused because she didn't want to compete with the couture house that was still kind of limping along in Paris. She said, no, my team in Place Vendôme is producing clothes. I'm not going to compete with that. So I don't have a good answer for you. Can we go in close on the pocket of the piece to the left of the hat? Oh, yeah.
See a little bit that it continues, it wraps around. And there it's actually pretty spacious. You know, it wouldn't be super, we wouldn't put a lot of heavy things in there. It's rather delicate, but it's beautifully embroidered.
So Jessica's pointing out, thank you so much, Jessica, that camouflage entered women's fashion in World War I. Thank you so much. That is actually one of the things that we see a lot of in talking with most designers. They invented X, and you know, then there's a contested discussion about who really invented it. Thanks, Jessica. Caitlin,
I have another question. I'm curious about this Zodiac collection. It's really striking that, and I think interesting because the Zodiac is so prominent currently. Was this like in the 1930s? Were there multiple different designers that worked with Zodiac collections or with this idea of the Zodiac, or was she on the forefront of that?
I can't think of anyone else. Anne, Jessica?
Not coming to the top of my head, but I would have to look around. I mean, that's a really interesting question. I know that it was very much a thing that people were thinking about and looking into. So it was definitely in people's minds, that suggests that she probably wasn't the only one, but I don't know of anybody using the prominent way that she did. I have to look that up though.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth bearing in mind that she had this slightly off background, or sort of off kilter background, I should say, in spiritualism during her marriage, her relatively short-lived marriage. where she and her husband would sort of dabble in spiritualism, really. I don't know that that has anything to do with the Zodiac collection. But yeah, Jessica's also suggesting if it's connected, is it possibly connected to interest in occultism? Quite possibly.
Yeah. I still just love all of these different seams and lines in this very simple dress. Simple seeming, but clearly not actually simple.
Yeah.
Well, it's let's see, nearly time for us to wrap up. Any further questions or things you want to look at before we close? All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Gaylard, for joining us and for sharing all of this information about Schiaparelli with us, and everybody for coming and participating and looking at these wonderful objects. The study center is still closed for appointments, but we hope to open in the coming months. And once we do, I hope that you'll come and visit us at the Henry. We'd just like to thank again Arts Fund and the Gwendolyn Carkeefe Plus Jeff Fund for the Decorative and Design Arts for making today's program possible. And we hope that you will join us next Thursday at noon. We are going to talk with Julia Harrison about jewelry in our collection. So thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.